The music stopped the moment Duke Alistair Blackwood raised his voice. Eleanor Hartley froze near the tall windows of the ballroom, her gloved hand still resting on a glass of lemon water she had not touched. She had heard her own name pulled through the crowd like a thread being yanked from cloth, and now every face in the room had turned toward her, waiting to see what she would do. "She isn't worth defending," the Duke said again, louder this time, as if the first time had not landed hard enough. His voice was smooth, almost bored, the way a man speaks when he believes the outcome does not matter to him at all. "Her family owes half the merchants in this city. Everyone knows it. Why should I pretend otherwise simply because Nathaniel feels sentimental tonight?" A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest guests, quiet but unmistakable, the kind of laughter people give when they want to be seen agreeing with power. Nathaniel Ashford, the only person who had tried to speak on Eleanor's behalf, stood with his jaw tight and his hands closed into fists at his sides. He was young and kind and completely outmatched by a duke's reputation. "Alistair," he said quietly, "you don't know the full story." "I know enough," the Duke replied, not even glancing at his friend. His eyes had found Eleanor across the room, and for a moment, something almost like curiosity crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I know that her father borrowed money he had no way to repay, and that she has spent the season smiling at anyone who might rescue her family from ruin. That is the whole story, is it not, Miss Hartley?" Eleanor felt heat climb up her neck, not from shame, but from something sharper. Anger, she realized. A clean, clear anger that steadied her spine instead of breaking it. She set the glass down on a passing tray without a sound and walked toward him, her skirts moving in slow, deliberate rustles across the polished floor. The crowd parted for her the way water parts for a stone thrown into it, curious to see what would happen next. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "You are correct, that my father borrowed money. You are wrong about everything else." The Duke tilted his head, amused. "Enlighten me then." "My father borrowed money to save the tenant farms on our land, not to fill his own pockets," Eleanor said. "Every family on our estate still has a roof and food this winter because of it. If that makes us poor in your eyes, then I suppose we are poor. But do not stand in this room and tell people I have spent my season hunting for a husband to save me, because it is a lie, and you know it is a lie, and you said it anyway because it was easier than admitting you know nothing about my family at all." For a moment, the ballroom was utterly silent. Somewhere near the back, a fan snapped shut. The Duke's expression flickered, just slightly, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. But whatever it was, he buried it quickly beneath the same cool detachment he always wore in public. "A passionate defense," he said, "though I notice you did not deny needing rescue, only the manner of it." Eleanor felt the words land like a slap, but she did not let her face show it. Instead she smiled, thin and controlled. "You will forgive me if I do not care to explain myself further to a man who decided what I was worth, before I ever opened my mouth." She turned before he could answer, and walked straight toward the doors leading out to the terrace, her chin lifted, her steps even. Behind her, she heard Nathaniel say something low and urgent to the Duke, and she heard the Duke give a short, dismissive reply she could not make out. She did not turn back to hear more. She refused to give the room the satisfaction of watching her wait. Outside, the night air was cold enough to sting, and Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the stone railing of the terrace, breathing slowly, until the shaking in her hands finally stopped. Below her, the city spread out in scattered points of lamplight, indifferent to what had just happened inside. She thought of her mother, waiting at home, with the household ledgers spread across the kitchen table, long after the servants had gone to bed. She thought of her younger sister Charlotte, who still believed their family's troubles were temporary, a storm that would pass if they simply waited it out. And she thought of her father, 3 years gone now, who had made one difficult choice to protect people who depended on him, and who would never know that his daughter was being mocked in ballrooms for the kindness he had shown. "You handled that better than most people would have," a voice said behind her. Eleanor turned to find Nathaniel Ashford standing a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression apologetic. "I did not ask for your defense," she said, though not unkindly. "I know. I offered it anyway, because it was true, and because someone needed to say it before he said something even worse." Nathaniel hesitated. "I am sorry, Miss Hartley. He is not usually like this. His father's death changed him, though I doubt that excuses tonight." "It does not," Eleanor said simply. "But thank you for trying." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, as though he wanted to say something more, then seemed to think better of it. "If there is ever anything I can do," he said instead, "you have only to ask." Eleanor gave him a small, tired smile. "I will remember that." He bowed and left her alone on the terrace, and she remained there a while longer, watching her breath turn to mist in the cold air, replaying the Duke's words in her mind, until they lost some of their sting through sheer repetition. By the time her carriage rattled up the narrow lane toward her family's estate, the anger had settled into something colder and more useful. She did not cry on the ride home, though she had expected to. Instead, she found herself thinking, with unexpected clarity, about numbers, about the household accounts she had quietly taken over managing after her father's death, the ones nobody in society knew she understood better than most men twice her age, about the small successes she had already achieved with the estate's finances, successes she had never spoken of, because a woman managing money was considered improper, even scandalous, in the circles she had grown up moving through. The Duke believed she was a burden waiting to be rescued. He believed her worth could be measured entirely by whether some fortunate marriage might save her family from ruin. It had never once occurred to him, standing there in his fine coat, with his father's title resting easily on his shoulders, that a woman might simply save herself. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the Hartley house, a handsome but weathered building, with ivy climbing one wall, and a chimney that smoked faintly against the night sky. Eleanor climbed down without waiting for the footman's hand, gathered her skirts, and walked up the front steps with a new kind of resolve settling into her chest, quiet and unshakable. Inside, a single candle still burned in the study window. Her mother was awake, as she always was these days, worrying over figures that refused to balance no matter how many times she added them. Eleanor paused at the door before going in, and allowed herself one final moment to feel the sting of the evening, the eyes of the room turning toward her, the Duke's voice saying she isn't worth defending as though it were an established fact, rather than a careless guess. Then she straightened her shoulders, opened the door, and stepped inside to face what remained of her family's fortune, already turning over the beginnings of a plan that no one in that ballroom would have believed her capable of forming. She did not yet know how far that plan would carry her, or that within a year, the very man who had dismissed her so easily would be standing at her door instead of across a crowded room, no longer certain of his own worth at all. Tonight, she only knew one thing clearly. She would never again allow anyone's opinion of her to decide what she was capable of becoming. Her mother looked up as she entered, tired eyes rimmed with worry, ledger pages spread before her like the pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. "Eleanor," she said softly, "you're home early." Was the evening truly so terrible? Eleanor crossed the room, pulled a chair beside her mother, and looked down at the columns of numbers that had haunted their household for 3 long years. For the first time since her father's death, she did not feel afraid of them. "No, Mother," she said quietly. "I think it may have been exactly the evening I needed." Her mother frowned, confused, but Eleanor only reached for the ledger, turning the pages with steady hands, already seeing patterns and possibilities that had escaped her before. Outside, the wind picked up against the windows, and somewhere across the city, in a grand house far removed from their modest one, Duke Alistair Blackwood was likely already forgetting her name, certain that the matter was closed, and the girl he had dismissed would fade quietly back into obscurity, where he believed she belonged. He could not have been more wrong. Morning came gray and damp, the kind of light that made the cracks in the ceiling plaster more visible than anyone in the house wanted them to be. Eleanor woke before the servants, dressed quickly, and made her way down to the study where the ledgers still lay open from the night before. She sat and read through every page twice, tracing the columns with her finger, noting where money had leaked away in small amounts that added up to something large and dangerous. Rent from 2 tenant farms had gone unpaid for a full season. A debt to a grain merchant named William Ashcombe had grown heavier, with interest, that nobody had thought to negotiate down. And beneath it all sat the largest debt of them all, the loan her father had taken out years ago to keep the tenant families fed through a brutal winter, a debt that had outlived him and settled onto her mother's shoulders like a stone. Charlotte wandered in around mid-morning, still in her dressing gown, hair loosely braided, humming a tune she had heard at a friend's house the week before. She was younger than Eleanor by 4 years, and still carried a kind of hopeful innocence that Eleanor sometimes envied and sometimes worried over in equal measure. "You look terribly serious this morning," Charlotte said, dropping into the chair across from her sister. "Was the ball truly so dull?" "It was not dull," Eleanor said, not looking up from the ledger. "It was informative." Charlotte tilted her head. "Informative how?" Eleanor set down her pen and studied her sister for a moment, weighing how much to say. She had never wanted to burden Charlotte with the full weight of their situation, but keeping secrets had a way of becoming its own kind of burden eventually. "The Duke of Blackwood said, in front of half the city, that I was not worth defending, that our family exists on nothing but borrowed money and false hope." Charlotte's humming stopped. "He said that? In front of everyone?" "He did. That's horrible. Someone should have said something." "Someone did," Eleanor said, thinking of Nathaniel's steady voice cutting through the crowd. It did not change anything. Charlotte reached across the table and took her sister's hand. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor looked down at the ledger again, at the neat columns of numbers she had taught herself to read, years before their father died, back when he still believed a daughter with a sharp mind for figures might one day be useful to the estate, rather than an oddity to be hidden away. She thought of all the times she had quietly corrected the household accounts without telling anyone, all the small adjustments that had kept the family afloat longer than it had any right to be. "I am going to stop hiding what I can do," Eleanor said finally. "I have been managing this household's finances in secret for 3 years, Charlotte, doing work that any solicitor in the city would charge a fortune for, and I have done it because I was told a woman with a talent for numbers is something to be embarrassed about rather than something to use. I do not intend to hide any longer." Charlotte's eyes widened. "But Mother would never allow it. If people learned you were doing such work openly, they would say terrible things." "People are already saying terrible things," Eleanor said. "At least this way I will have done something to earn it." Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked the short distance to the modest office of Edmund Wallace, the family solicitor who had handled their father's affairs since before Eleanor was born. Edmund was an older man with kind eyes and a habit of speaking slowly, as though every word deserved careful consideration before it left his mouth. He listened patiently as Eleanor laid out her plan, her voice steady, even as the idea sounded increasingly bold the longer she spoke it aloud. She wanted to offer her services, quietly and without her name attached, helping merchants and small estate owners untangle debts and mismanaged accounts. She had already spotted 3 separate errors in her own family's ledgers within a single morning. She was certain she could do the same for others, if only someone would give her the chance. "It is unusual," Edmund said carefully, once she had finished. "A woman working in finance, even quietly, even under another name, would raise questions if it ever came to light." "I am aware of the risk," Eleanor said, "but I have already weighed it against the alternative, which is watching my family slide further into debt while I sit in a drawing room accepting compliments on my needlework." Edmund studied her for a long moment, then allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Your father would have been proud to hear you say that, though he might have worried for you all the same." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully against his desk. "There is a merchant guild in the city, run by a man named Henry Whitfield. He deals with traders and small estate owners who cannot afford proper solicitors, and he has been complaining for months about the poor state of their accounts. He would not need to know your full name, only that you are capable and discreet. Would he agree to it?" "He is a practical man," Edmund said. "If you can show him results, I suspect he would agree to almost anything." That evening, Eleanor sat again with the household ledgers, but this time with a different kind of energy, driving her pen across the pages. She reorganized the columns her father had left in disarray, corrected 2 errors that had been quietly draining money for years, and drafted a short letter proposing a meeting under a modest professional name, E. Hartley, financial consultant, careful to keep her given name concealed enough to avoid immediate assumptions about her identity, while still leaving enough truth in it that she would not feel as though she were living entirely behind a mask. Her mother found her still working, long after midnight, candle burned low, papers spread in careful order across the desk. "Eleanor," her mother said softly, standing in the doorway, with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "What is all this?" Eleanor set down her pen and met her mother's tired eyes. "It is the beginning of a plan, Mother. I know you have spent 3 years trying to manage everything alone, trying to protect Charlotte and me from how bad things truly are. I am not going to let you carry that weight by yourself any longer." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, though whether from worry or relief, Eleanor could not entirely tell. "Your father always said you had a mind sharper than most men he knew." He used to say it quietly, of course, because it was not the sort of thing one said openly about a daughter, but he meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. "Then I intend to prove him right," Eleanor said, "even if the rest of the city never learns my name." The following morning, Eleanor sent her letter to Henry Whitfield through Edmund's office, careful instructions attached regarding discretion, and spent the rest of the day walking the boundaries of the estate with the steward, learning firsthand which tenant farms were struggling and which were finally beginning to recover. She listened to farmers describe their harvests, noted which fields needed new drainage, and quietly began sketching out a longer plan in her mind, one that stretched far beyond simply balancing a single household's books. By the time she returned home, as the sun began to set, a reply had already arrived from Henry Whitfield's office, brief and to the point, requesting a meeting within the week to discuss a trial arrangement. Eleanor read the letter twice, feeling something unfamiliar rise in her chest, a small, cautious flicker of hope she had not allowed herself in a very long time. She thought briefly of the Duke's voice in the ballroom, dismissing her as though her worth had already been decided by other people's opinions of her family's misfortune. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her writing desk, where she kept the few things she considered truly important. Whatever came next, she intended to build it entirely on her own terms, far from any ballroom, far from any title, and far from anyone who believed a woman's value could be measured only by the man willing to rescue her. The meeting with Henry Whitfield took place in a cramped office above a busy trading hall, the air thick with the smell of ink and old paper, the sound of carts and shouting merchants drifting up through the open window. Eleanor arrived wearing a plain gray dress and a dark bonnet, her hair pinned back with none of the ornamentation she would have worn to a society gathering, determined to look like exactly what she was, a woman there to work rather than to be admired. Henry Whitfield turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his middle years, with ink stains on his fingers and a habit of speaking quickly, as though time itself were a resource he could not afford to waste. He did not rise fully from his chair when she entered, only glanced up briefly before gesturing toward the seat across from his cluttered desk. "Edmund tells me you have a talent for untangling accounts," he said without preamble. "I have heard that claim before, from men who turned out to be little more than clever talkers. Convince me you are different." Eleanor did not flinch at his bluntness. Instead, she opened the small satchel she had brought and withdrew a set of papers, the reorganized ledger from her own family estate, cleaned and corrected, alongside a brief written analysis of where the errors had originated and how much money they had cost over 3 years. Henry took the papers and studied them in silence for several long minutes, his brow furrowing as he traced the columns with one ink-stained finger. When he finally looked up, something in his expression had shifted, sharpened with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. "This is your own family's accounts?" "It is." "You corrected 3 years of errors your solicitor never caught?" "He was managing a dozen other estates at the time," Eleanor said evenly. "I had only one, and far more reason to look closely." Henry set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, studying her with new consideration. "I have 3 accounts on my desk right now, belonging to merchants who trust me to find them help, and every solicitor I have sent them to has either overcharged them or missed the true source of the trouble entirely. If you can do for them what you did here, I will pay you fairly, and I will not ask questions about your circumstances beyond what is necessary for the work." "That is all I am asking for," Eleanor said. "One condition," Henry added, holding up a finger. "You work under the name you have given me, E. Hartley. Most of these men will not sit across a table from a woman offering financial advice, whatever their debts may say about their judgment. If they never see your face, they cannot object to your methods." Eleanor considered this for a moment. It stung slightly, the reminder that her skill would be more readily accepted if her identity remained hidden. But she had expected as much, and she had already decided the work itself mattered more than the credit for it, at least for now. "Agreed," she said. Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into the work, with an intensity that surprised even her. She reviewed ledgers late into the night, sent detailed written recommendations through Henry's office, and watched with quiet satisfaction as struggling merchants slowly climbed out from under debts that had seemed impossible to escape only months before. A grain trader named Oscar Pemberton, whose accounts had been in such disarray that he faced losing his shop entirely, wrote a letter of gratitude so effusive that Henry read parts of it aloud, laughing at the man's insistence that E. Hartley must surely be some kind of financial wizard. Eleanor kept these small victories close to her chest, sharing them only with her mother and Charlotte during quiet evenings at home, where the three of them had begun to feel, for the first time in years, that their circumstances might genuinely improve, rather than simply survive. Word of E. Hartley's skill began to spread quietly through Henry's circle of contacts, always in whispers, always with a note of curiosity about the mysterious consultant who never appeared in person and communicated only through careful, precise letters. Some assumed E. Hartley was an elderly recluse. Others guessed at a young man too shy for society. No one guessed the truth, and Eleanor found a strange, private amusement in that fact, watching her reputation grow, while her actual name remained tucked safely out of sight. Meanwhile, the debt on her family's estate began, slowly but steadily, to shrink. She negotiated new terms with William Ashcombe, the grain merchant her father had owed money to, using knowledge she had gained from working directly with men in his position, understanding exactly what arguments would appeal to his own practical interests rather than his sympathy. She reorganized the tenant farm agreements to ensure steadier income throughout the year, rather than relying entirely on harvest season. Piece by piece, the crushing weight that had settled over the Hartley household since her father's death began to lift. One evening, as autumn deepened and the trees along the estate's long drive turned gold and brown, Eleanor sat with her mother reviewing the household accounts together, something they had not done as equals until now. "I never imagined we would see numbers like these again," her mother said quietly, running her finger down a column that showed, for the first time in years, more money coming in than going out. "Your father would hardly believe it." "He always believed I could manage numbers," Eleanor said. "He simply never had the chance to see what I could do with them, given a real opportunity." Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. "I am proud of you, Eleanor. Whatever anyone in that ballroom said about you, they clearly had no idea who they were speaking to." Eleanor smiled, though a small part of her mind drifted, unbidden, back to the Duke's cold voice, declaring she was not worth defending. She wondered, briefly, whether he ever thought of that night at all, whether her name had lingered in his memory, even a single day past the ball, or whether he had already moved on to some other target for his careless judgments. She did not yet know that his own circumstances were about to change in ways that would make her question resurface far sooner than she expected, nor that the quiet, careful reputation she had built as E. Hartley was about to draw the attention of the very man who had once dismissed her so completely. For now, she simply closed the ledger, satisfied with the steady progress written across its pages, and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel something like peace. Across the city, in a house far grander than the Hartley estate, Duke Alistair Blackwood sat alone in his father's old study, staring at a stack of papers he had been avoiding for nearly a month. The fire had burned low, and he had not bothered to call for more wood, too absorbed in the growing sense of dread building in his chest as he read through documents that made less sense with every passing hour. His father had died the previous winter, quickly and quietly, leaving behind a title, an estate, and, as Alistair was only now discovering, a mountain of debts carefully hidden behind years of careful appearances. The old Duke had always presented himself as a man of considerable wealth, hosting lavish gatherings, maintaining a full staff, and never once suggesting to his son that any of it rested on borrowed money and delayed payments that had finally come due. Frederick, the estate's longtime steward, stood near the study door, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for his employer to speak. He had served the Blackwood family for over 20 years, and the weariness in his expression suggested he had known about the estate's troubles far longer than Alistair had. "How long have you known about this?" Alistair asked finally, not looking up from the papers. "Longer than I would have liked, Your Grace," Frederick admitted. "Your father instructed me to keep the matter quiet. He believed he would resolve it before it became necessary to trouble you." He died before resolving it. Yes, Your Grace. Alistair set down the papers and rubbed his eyes, feeling the beginnings of a headache building behind them. How bad is it, truly? Give me the number, Frederick. No more careful phrasing. Frederick hesitated only a moment before answering. The estate owes considerable sums to 3 separate creditors, Your Grace. The largest, a man named Gideon Cross, has already sent 2 letters requesting payment within the month, with threats of legal action should the debt remain unpaid. There are smaller debts as well, accumulated interest on loans taken years ago, along with unpaid wages to several tradesmen who worked on the East Wing renovations before your father's death. And the estate's income? Sufficient to maintain the household, Your Grace, but nowhere near sufficient to clear debts of this size within the time frame Mr. Cross has demanded. Alistair leaned back in his chair, feeling something cold settle into his stomach, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation for a man who had spent his entire life secure in the knowledge that his family's wealth and position were unshakable. He thought, unbidden, of the confidence with which he had spoken at the ball weeks earlier, dismissing Eleanor Hartley's family troubles as though poverty were a moral failing rather than simply circumstance. The memory sat uncomfortably now, though he pushed it aside quickly, unwilling to examine it too closely. Send word to my usual circle, he said instead. Surely someone can extend a short-term loan until the estate's finances are properly sorted. Frederick's expression grew careful, almost pained. I have already made discreet inquiries, Your Grace. I regret to say, the response has been less encouraging than we might have hoped. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning that word of the estate's difficulties has already begun to circulate, however quietly we have tried to contain it. Several of your father's former associates have expressed reluctance to become entangled in what they perceive as a sinking situation. Alistair felt a flush of anger rise in his chest, sharp and immediate. These are men my father called friends for decades. Your father called many men friends, Your Grace, Frederick said quietly. Whether the feeling was ever truly mutual is a separate question entirely. The words landed harder than Frederick likely intended, and Alistair sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing them. He thought of the ballroom again, unbidden, of the ease with which he had declared another person unworthy of defense or sympathy, certain in that moment that his own position was too secure to ever require either. The irony of his current circumstances was not lost on him, however much he wished to ignore it. Over the following weeks, Alistair discovered just how quickly a title could lose its weight once the money behind it grew uncertain. Invitations that had once arrived weekly slowed to a trickle. A gathering he hosted, smaller and more modest than those his father used to hold, drew a noticeably thinner crowd, and several guests who did attend spent the evening exchanging quiet, knowing glances rather than genuine conversation. Nathaniel Ashford remained loyal, one of the few who did not seem to care whether Alistair's fortune had changed. But even his support could not solve the growing pile of unpaid debts threatening to consume the estate entirely. You need someone who understands accounts better than Frederick does, Nathaniel said one evening, as the 2 men sat in what remained of the estate's once impressive wine cellar, now noticeably emptier than it had been a year before. I have heard talk of a consultant working through the Merchant Guild, someone Henry Whitfield swears by. They go by the name E. Hartley, and apparently they have pulled 6 struggling merchants back from the edge of ruin over the past several months. Alistair frowned. A merchant's solution for a merchant's problem. I doubt whoever this consultant is has ever handled an estate the size of mine. Perhaps not, Nathaniel said, but your other options appear to be growing thin, Alistair, and pride will not pay Gideon Cross what he is owed. The name Hartley registered somewhere in the back of Alistair's mind, a faint discomfort he could not quite place, though he dismissed it as coincidence, certain the name was common enough to mean nothing in particular. He had, after all, spent very little time thinking of Eleanor Hartley since the night of the ball, or so he told himself, ignoring the small, persistent memory of her steady voice refusing to back down from his careless words. Arrange a meeting, Alistair said finally, the words tasting bitter in his mouth, an admission of vulnerability he had never expected to make. If this consultant is as capable as you claim, I suppose pride is a luxury I can no longer afford. Nathaniel nodded, relief evident on his face. I will send word to Henry Whitfield's office tomorrow. Alone again that night, Alistair stood at the window of his study, looking out over grounds that had once seemed to stretch endlessly, secure and untouchable. Now every acre felt like a debt waiting to be called due, every familiar comfort suddenly fragile, in a way he had never before considered possible. He thought again, more directly this time, of the ballroom, of Eleanor Hartley's composed anger, as she corrected him in front of an audience, eager to see her humiliated instead. He had believed himself untouchable that night, secure in a position she could never threaten. He was beginning to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, just how quickly such certainty could crumble, and he wondered, with a flicker of something he did not yet want to name, what it might feel like to stand on the other side of judgment for once. He had no way of knowing yet just how directly he was about to find out. Henry Whitfield's letter arrived at the Hartley estate on a cool morning in early winter, and Eleanor read it twice before she allowed herself to fully absorb what it was asking of her. A new client wished to engage her services, Henry wrote, a client of considerable standing, whose estate had fallen into significant debt following a change in leadership. The client had specifically requested a face-to-face meeting, rather than the usual written correspondence, citing the scale and urgency of the situation. Henry had tried, he explained, to convince the man that written analysis would serve just as well, but the client had been insistent, and given the size of the potential fee involved, Henry strongly encouraged Eleanor to consider making an exception to her usual practice. Eleanor read the letter a third time, her eyes catching on the name mentioned near the bottom, almost as an afterthought. The client's estate, Henry noted, belonged to Duke Alistair Blackwood. For a long moment, Eleanor simply sat with the letter in her hands, feeling something complicated stir in her chest, equal parts disbelief, and a grim, unexpected satisfaction. She thought of the ballroom, of his cold voice, declaring her unworthy of defense, of the laughter that had rippled through the crowd at her expense. She thought of how certain he had seemed that night, how untouchable, how thoroughly convinced that people like her existed only to be judged and dismissed by people like him. Now here he was, reaching out through an intermediary, unaware that the very woman he had humiliated was the one holding the solution to his troubles in her hands. Charlotte found her still sitting with the letter, well into the afternoon, staring out the window with an expression her sister could not quite read. "You look as though you have seen a ghost," Charlotte said, settling into the chair beside her. In a manner of speaking, Eleanor said, and handed her sister the letter. Charlotte read it quickly, her eyes widening as she reached the name at the bottom. "The Duke? The same one who humiliated you at the ball?" "The very same. You cannot possibly agree to meet with him." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, weighing the anger still simmering quietly beneath her composed exterior, against the practical reality of what such a client could mean for her growing reputation, and, more selfishly perhaps, what it might mean to stand in front of him now, no longer the girl he had dismissed so easily, but someone whose skill and judgment he desperately needed. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that I want very much to agree to it. Why would you willingly put yourself through that?" Eleanor folded the letter carefully, her expression settling into something calm and deliberate. "Because for months, I have built something entirely my own, something no one in that ballroom believed I was capable of, and I find I am curious to see his face, when he realizes exactly who has been solving his problems, while he was too proud to notice." Charlotte studied her sister for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across her face. "I suppose there is a certain justice in that." That evening, Eleanor wrote back to Henry Whitfield, agreeing to the meeting under one careful condition, that her identity remain concealed from the client until the moment she herself chose to reveal it. Henry, delighted at securing such a valuable client, agreed without hesitation, arranging for the meeting to take place at his own office, rather than the Duke's estate, a small concession Eleanor appreciated for the sense of control it offered her over the encounter to come. In the days leading up to the meeting, Eleanor prepared with the same meticulous care she brought to every client's accounts, though this time the preparation felt different, sharper somehow, driven by more than simple professional pride. She reviewed everything Henry could tell her about the Blackwood estate's public reputation, cross-referenced what little information circulated about the family's spending habits, and began sketching out, in broad strokes, the kind of financial recovery plan the estate would likely require. She found herself, more than once, imagining the moment of the reveal, turning over in her mind exactly what she might say, exactly how she wanted to carry herself when the Duke finally understood who had been sitting across from him all along. She was careful, though, not to let the anticipation curdle into something bitter or petty. She did not want revenge, she realized, turning the thought over slowly one evening, as she sat by the fire with her mother's old shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She wanted, more than anything, for him to understand exactly how wrong he had been, and to understand it not through cruelty returned in kind, but through the simple, undeniable fact of her competence. Her mother, when told of the upcoming meeting, expressed immediate concern. "Eleanor, are you certain this is wise? The man humiliated you in front of half the city. What if seeing him again only reopens that wound?" "I have thought of little else since the letter arrived," Eleanor admitted, "but I keep returning to the same conclusion. I built this reputation without his knowledge or his help. Whatever happens when he learns the truth, it will not undo a single thing I have already accomplished. If anything, it will only make the accomplishment harder for him to dismiss." Her mother studied her for a long moment, then reached over and squeezed her hand. "Your father would have been so proud to see the woman you have become, Eleanor. Whatever happens in that meeting, remember that his opinion of you carries no real weight over your worth. It never truly did." On the morning of the meeting, Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a dark blue gown of simple, elegant cut, nothing so plain as to suggest poverty, nothing so fine as to suggest she had dressed for his benefit rather than her own professional dignity. She pinned her hair back neatly, took one final steadying breath in front of the small mirror in her room, and made her way toward Henry Whitfield's office, her heart pounding, with an anticipation she had not felt since the night of the ball itself. She did not yet know exactly how the Duke would react when the truth finally came to light, whether he would retreat into the same cold arrogance he had shown her that night, or whether the pressures of his current circumstances had softened him even slightly. She only knew, walking through the busy morning streets toward the meeting, that would change both their lives in ways neither of them could yet fully predict, that she was ready, at last, to face him, not as the girl he had judged unworthy, but as the woman who held, quite literally, the solution to his troubles in her own capable hands. Henry Whitfield's office had been tidied for the occasion, the usual clutter of papers pushed into neat stacks along one wall, an extra chair brought in and positioned across from his desk. Eleanor arrived early, as was her habit, and sat quietly composing herself, while Henry paced near the window, glancing repeatedly at the street below. "He should arrive within the quarter hour," Henry said, more to himself than to her. "I must say, Miss Hartley, I am still not entirely certain why you insisted on concealing your identity until the meeting itself. A written introduction beforehand might have made things considerably smoother." "There are reasons," Eleanor said simply, offering nothing further, and Henry, wisely, did not press the matter. When the carriage finally arrived outside, Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, despite her best efforts to remain calm. She heard footsteps on the stairs, unhurried and confident, the sound of a man accustomed to being received wherever he went. Henry moved quickly to open the door, and a moment later, Duke Alistair Blackwood stepped into the small office, filling the modest space with a presence that seemed slightly at odds with the plainness of his surroundings. He looked, Eleanor noted immediately, thinner than she remembered from the ball, a certain tightness around his eyes suggesting weeks of poor sleep and mounting worry. He wore his clothes well still, but there was a strain beneath the polished exterior that had not been there before, and for a brief moment, Eleanor felt an unexpected flicker of something almost like sympathy, quickly overtaken by the memory of exactly why she was sitting in this room at all. "Your Grace," Henry said, bowing slightly, "thank you for coming. Allow me to introduce the consultant I mentioned in my letters." The Duke's eyes moved toward Eleanor, polite and distracted, clearly expecting to find a stranger seated in the chair. For a moment, nothing registered at all, his gaze simply passing over her the way one's eyes pass over an unfamiliar face in a crowded room. Then recognition arrived, slow and unmistakable, his expression shifting from polite indifference to open, undisguised shock. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice catching slightly on her name. "Your Grace," Eleanor replied, rising smoothly from her chair, her composure absolute, despite the pounding of her own heart. "It seems we meet again, under rather different circumstances." Henry looked between them, clearly confused. "You are acquainted?" "We have met," Eleanor said, before the Duke could offer his own explanation, briefly, "at a ball some months ago." The Duke seemed momentarily unable to speak, his eyes moving from Eleanor to Henry, and back again. as though trying to reconcile two facts that refused to sit comfortably together in his mind. "You are E. Hartley," he said finally, the words carrying equal parts disbelief and something that sounded almost like embarrassment. "The consultant Henry has been recommending for months, the one who saved half his merchant contacts from ruin." "I am," Eleanor said simply. Henry, sensing the tension in the room, but not fully understanding its source, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps I should leave the two of you to discuss the particulars of the estate's finances. I have some correspondence to attend to in the outer office." He excused himself quickly, closing the door behind him, leaving Eleanor and the Duke alone in the small room, the silence stretching between them thick with unspoken history. "You never mentioned this to Henry," the Duke said finally, lowering himself slowly into the chair across from her, his usual composure visibly shaken, "that we had met before." "I did not think it was relevant to the work," Eleanor said, resuming her own seat with careful deliberation. "Though I admit I was curious to see your expression when you finally understood who had been reviewing your family's accounts." A flush of color rose in the Duke's face, something between shame and defensiveness. "You allowed this meeting specifically to see my reaction." "I allowed this meeting because your steward's inquiries reached my associate, and because I have built a reputation over the past several months, entirely on my own merit, without your name or your approval attached to any of it," Eleanor said, her voice steady and even. "If you are looking for an apology for surprising you, Your Grace, you will not find one here." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not entirely read, something caught between old pride and new, uncomfortable understanding. "The things I said at the ball," he began slowly, "were unfair." "They were," Eleanor agreed simply. "I did not know you at all, and yet I spoke as though I understood your entire situation." "You did." He seemed to search for something further to say, some way to soften the moment, but Eleanor did not offer him an easy path forward. She had not come to this meeting seeking his apology, however welcome it might be to finally hear one. She had come because his estate's troubles represented an opportunity she had earned through months of quiet, careful work, and she intended to treat the matter with exactly the professional seriousness it deserved. "Your Grace," she said, drawing a small stack of papers from her satchel and placing them on the desk between them. "Whatever passed between us at that ball, I am here now, in a professional capacity. Your estate's finances are in serious difficulty, and Henry tells me the situation has grown urgent. If you wish to engage my services, I am prepared to review your accounts and offer a plan for recovery. If you would prefer to seek assistance elsewhere given our history, I understand entirely, and I wish you good fortune in finding it." The Duke stared at the papers, then back at her, something shifting visibly behind his eyes, a recalculation of everything he thought he understood about the woman sitting across from him. "You would still help me," he said slowly, "after everything I said." "I would help your estate," Eleanor corrected, "because doing so is my profession, and because I do not allow personal history to interfere with my work. Whether that assistance extends any grace toward you personally is an entirely separate question, one I have not yet decided." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing at all, simply absorbing the quiet, unshakable dignity of the woman he had once dismissed so carelessly as unworthy of defense. Finally, he reached across the desk and drew the papers toward himself, his hands not entirely steady. "Then I would like to engage your services, Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "if you are willing." Eleanor studied him a moment longer, searching his face for any trace of the arrogance that had defined him at the ball, finding instead something closer to genuine humility, however new and unfamiliar it seemed to sit on him. "I am willing," she said finally, "but you should understand something clearly before we begin. I will manage your accounts with the same care and honesty I bring to every client. What I will not do is pretend that the words you spoke about me no longer exist, simply because you now find yourself in need of my help." The Duke nodded slowly, something in his expression settling into quiet acceptance. "That seems more than fair, Miss Hartley." Outside, the afternoon light shifted through the window, casting long shadows across the small office, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since the night of the ball, that the balance between them had shifted permanently, and irreversibly, in her favor. The weeks that followed the meeting brought a strange new rhythm to Eleanor's days, one she had not entirely anticipated when she agreed to take on the Blackwood estate as a client. She reviewed the Duke's accounts with the same thoroughness she gave every project, uncovering layer after layer of mismanagement left behind by his late father, debts compounded by neglect, and income streams that had never been properly organized to begin with. The Duke, for his part, seemed determined at first to manage the situation partly on his own terms, still clinging to old habits of pride, even as his circumstances grew more precarious by the week. He sent letters to old family friends, requesting short-term assistance, invoking his father's name and his own title, as though the words alone still carried the weight they once had. Each request was met with polite refusal, or worse, with silence that stretched on for days before a carefully worded decline finally arrived. Eleanor watched this pattern unfold through Henry's office, hearing second-hand accounts of the Duke's increasingly desperate attempts to solve his troubles through connections, rather than through the careful, unglamorous work she had already begun laying out for him. When Frederick arrived one afternoon with a fresh stack of financial documents, his expression carried a weariness that suggested even the estate's own steward had grown tired of watching his employer resist the obvious solution sitting directly in front of him. He believes if he simply calls upon the right people, the matter will resolve itself, Frederick admitted quietly, setting the papers down on Henry's desk. I have tried to explain that pride will not clear a debt of this size, but old habits prove difficult to break, particularly for a man raised to believe his name alone should open every door. Eleanor listened without comment, though she felt a familiar frustration stirring beneath her calm exterior. She had seen this pattern before in other clients, the reluctance to accept that circumstances had truly changed, the belief that some final grand gesture might restore what careful, patient work alone could actually rebuild. It was Beatrice Langford, a prominent figure among the city's social circles, and someone who had once counted the Blackwood family among her closest acquaintances, who finally delivered the blow that forced the Duke to fully accept his new reality. At a gathering he had been invited to more out of habit than genuine welcome, Beatrice made a point of publicly declining his request for a private word, her voice carrying just far enough for the surrounding guests to hear every syllable. I am afraid I have no wish to discuss financial matters this evening, Your Grace, she said, her tone carrying the same casual cruelty Alistair himself had once directed toward Eleanor. One hears such troubling things about the state of your affairs. I do hope you understand, I must be careful about where I extend my own generosity these days. The room, Nathaniel later reported to Eleanor through a brief note passed along via Henry's office, had gone quiet in exactly the way it had the night Alistair humiliated Eleanor at the ball, every eye turning toward the Duke to see how he would respond to being dismissed so publicly himself. He had said nothing, Nathaniel wrote, simply nodded stiffly, and excused himself from the gathering entirely. The first time in living memory anyone could recall the Duke of Blackwood leaving an event early. When Eleanor read this account, she felt no particular satisfaction in it, though she recognized the strange, uncomfortable symmetry of the moment. She thought of her own composed anger on the terrace after the ball, the way she had refused to let the humiliation break her, and wondered whether the Duke possessed that same resilience, or whether the sudden reversal of his fortunes might break him entirely instead. She got her answer a few days later, when the Duke arrived at Henry's office for their scheduled review, visibly subdued in a way she had not yet seen from him. He sat across from her without his usual guarded composure, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting sleepless nights, and listened without interruption as she laid out, point by point, exactly how deep his financial troubles truly ran. I attempted to solve this the way my father would have, he admitted finally, when she had finished speaking, through connections, through favors called in, through the simple assumption that my name would carry enough weight to smooth over any difficulty. I am beginning to understand that assumption was always more fragile than I believed. Names rarely solve what careful work can accomplish instead, Eleanor said simply. Your father built considerable debt hiding behind the appearance of wealth. Continuing that pattern will only deepen the hole rather than climb out of it. The Duke nodded slowly, something in his posture shifting, a visible surrender of the pride that had defined him at the ball months earlier. Then tell me what you believe I should actually do, Miss Hartley. Not what my name suggests I am owed, but what the numbers themselves demand. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the genuine change she sensed beneath his words, against the memory of exactly how easily he had once dismissed her worth, without a second thought. She decided, finally, that whatever personal history remained unresolved between them, her professional obligation came first. You will need to sell several parcels of land that generate little income relative to their upkeep, she said, drawing out a map she had prepared, showing the estate's holdings, marked in careful color-coded sections. You will need to renegotiate terms with your primary creditor, Mr. Cross, using leverage I have already identified in his own financial position. And you will need to reduce your household expenses significantly, beginning with staff you do not strictly require, and entertainments you can no longer justify. The Duke absorbed each point without argument, a marked change from the man who had once believed his position immune to such practical concerns. And if I do all of this, then within 2 years, perhaps less, if the harvests cooperate, your estate could be free of its most pressing debts entirely, Eleanor said. It will require patience, and it will require setting aside pride in favor of practical sacrifice. Both, I suspect, will prove more difficult for you than the numbers themselves. The Duke let out a short, humorless laugh, though there was no anger in it, only a tired kind of recognition. You are not wrong, Miss Hartley. I have spent my entire life believing pride and sacrifice belong to other people's circumstances, not my own. Many people believe that, Eleanor said, until circumstances teach them otherwise. He looked at her then, something searching in his expression, as though trying to reconcile the woman before him with the girl he had so carelessly judged months earlier. I find myself wondering, Miss Hartley, how differently that night at the ball might have gone, had I known even a fraction of what you are clearly capable of. It would have changed nothing about the cruelty of what you said, Eleanor replied evenly, only perhaps the accuracy of it. The Duke had no response to that, and Eleanor did not offer him one, gathering her papers instead, and preparing to leave, the weight of unfinished history between them, settling into something neither triumphant nor entirely resolved, but undeniably, permanently changed. Winter settled fully over the city, and with it came a slow, steady transformation in Duke Alistair Blackwood, that even those who knew him best found difficult to fully believe at first. He began following Eleanor's recommendations with a discipline that surprised everyone, including, perhaps, himself. He sold 2 parcels of land that had cost more to maintain than they ever returned in income, reduced his household staff to a number appropriate for his actual needs rather than the appearance he had once felt compelled to maintain, and sat through long, uncomfortable meetings with Gideon Cross, renegotiating terms with a patience that would have seemed impossible to him only months before. Frederick, watching these changes unfold, remarked quietly to Nathaniel one evening that he had not seen his employer work so hard at anything in all his years of service. He used to believe difficulty was something that happened to other people, Frederick said. I confess I did not expect him to adapt so thoroughly once it finally arrived at his own door. The changes extended beyond simple financial discipline, however. Alistair began paying closer attention to the small cruelties of his social circle that he had once participated in without a second thought, the casual dismissals, the careless judgments passed on people whose circumstances differed from his own. He found himself, more than once, recognizing in others the same thoughtless certainty he had once directed toward Eleanor, and increasingly, he found he could no longer stay silent when he witnessed it. The moment that changed things most decisively came at a modest gathering hosted by Nathaniel, where a young woman named Grace Whitmore, a distant relation of one of the city's merchant families, found herself the subject of exactly the kind of casual gossip that had once destroyed reputations without a second thought given to their accuracy. A guest, emboldened by wine and the easy cruelty of a captive audience, began suggesting loudly that Grace's family fortune had been built on dishonest dealings, embellishing rumors with details that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Alistair, standing nearby, felt something sharpen in his chest, a recognition so immediate it startled him. He remembered, with uncomfortable clarity, standing in nearly the same position months earlier, delivering nearly the same casual cruelty toward Eleanor Hartley, certain that his own opinion carried enough weight to settle the matter beyond dispute. That is quite enough, Alistair said, his voice cutting through the gossip with unexpected firmness. The room quieted, several guests turning toward him in surprise. Miss Whitmore's family affairs are not yours to speculate upon, particularly when your information appears to rest on nothing more substantial than rumor repeated until it sounds like fact. The guest who had been speaking flushed, clearly unprepared for the Duke's intervention. I only meant, I know precisely what you meant, Alistair said. I have said similar things myself, about a person who deserved far better than my careless judgment. I do not intend to stand by and watch the same mistake repeated in front of me, without saying something this time. Grace, visibly relieved, offered him a grateful, if slightly bewildered smile, and the conversation moved awkwardly onward to safer topics. Nathaniel, catching Alistair's eye from across the room, offered a small, approving nod that carried more meaning than words might have managed. Later that evening, as the gathering began to thin, Nathaniel found a quiet moment to speak with his friend privately. That was well done, Alistair. I do not think I have ever seen you defend someone so directly before. I have been thinking of little else these past months, Alistair admitted. The way I spoke about Miss Hartley that night, I told myself, at the time, that I was simply stating facts, that her family's circumstances made my words accurate rather than cruel. I understand now how thoroughly I convinced myself of something entirely false. What changed your mind? Watching her prove, week after week, exactly how wrong I was, Alistair said, and understanding, slowly, how it feels to have your own worth questioned by people who have decided your circumstances, tell them everything they need to know about your character. Nathaniel studied his friend for a long moment. Have you told her any of this? I have apologized for the surprise of the meeting, Alistair said. I do not believe I have properly apologized for the words themselves. I am not certain she would accept it, even if I tried. Perhaps not, Nathaniel agreed, but I suspect the attempt matters more than you realize, regardless of how she receives it. In the weeks that followed, Alistair began quietly working to repay not just his financial debts, but something less tangible as well. He wrote a letter to William Ashcombe, the grain merchant whose dealings with the Hartley family he had once dismissed so casually as evidence of their poor judgment, offering a formal apology for assumptions he had made without ever bothering to learn the truth. He began, cautiously, extending small kindnesses to others in the city, whose circumstances had made them targets of the same casual cruelty he had once wielded without thought. Quiet gestures that asked for no recognition and received little, beyond the private satisfaction of finally using his position for something other than careless judgment. Eleanor, hearing occasional accounts of these changes through Henry's office and through Nathaniel's careful updates, found herself uncertain how to feel about the transformation unfolding in the man who had once wounded her so publicly. She remained professionally committed to his estate's recovery, continuing to send detailed recommendations and reviewing his progress with the same careful attention she gave every client. But she found, increasingly, that the anger she had carried since the night of the ball had begun to soften into something more complicated, not quite forgiveness, but something adjacent to it, a grudging respect for a man willing to genuinely examine his own failures, rather than simply weather the consequences and return to old habits once the danger had passed. She did not yet know how far his transformation would carry him, or that the final test of his sincerity was still to come, arriving not in a ballroom or an office, but at her own front door, in circumstances that would ask far more of him than any financial recovery plan ever could. The final crisis arrived without warning, exactly as such things often do. Gideon Cross, despite months of careful renegotiation, suddenly withdrew his agreement to extended payment terms, citing pressure from his own creditors and demanding immediate settlement of the full remaining debt within a fortnight. Frederick delivered the news to Alistair late one evening, his expression grim, and for the first time in months, Alistair felt the old, familiar panic of that first sleepless night in his father's study, threatening to overwhelm him entirely. He sent word immediately to Henry's office, requesting an urgent meeting with Eleanor, but her reply, when it came, carried news that made his chest tighten further still. She had left the city briefly to visit a client whose estate lay several hours away, Henry explained, and would not return for at least 3 days, well past the point where Gideon Cross's patience was likely to hold. Alistair spent that night reviewing every document Eleanor had helped him organize, searching desperately for some solution he might have missed, some remaining asset he could liquidate quickly enough to satisfy Cross's sudden demand. He found nothing sufficient, no matter how many times he recalculated the figures, and as dawn approached, exhausted and increasingly desperate, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would go to her directly. Not to Henry's office, not through careful, professional correspondence, but to her family's estate itself, To ask, plainly, and without the protection of his title, for whatever help she might still be willing to offer him. The ride took longer than he expected, the road still dark and half frozen in the early morning cold, and by the time his carriage rolled to a stop outside the modest Hartley estate, the first pale light of dawn had only just begun creeping over the horizon. He climbed down without waiting for his driver's assistance, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the long, sleepless night, and walked up the front steps with none of the easy confidence that had once defined every entrance he ever made into any room. He knocked, and waited, his breath clouding in the cold morning air, uncertain whether anyone would even answer at such an early hour. It was Eleanor herself who opened the door, already dressed and awake, clearly having just returned from her journey the evening before, and risen early out of habit rather than necessity. Her expression, upon finding the Duke standing on her doorstep at dawn, shifted quickly from surprise to careful, guarded assessment. "Your Grace," she said slowly, "this is an unusual hour for a visit." "I am aware," Alistair said, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice carried none of its usual composure, only a raw, unguarded honesty that startled her. "I would not have come like this if the matter were not urgent. Gideon Cross has withdrawn his agreement to the extended terms. He is demanding full payment within a fortnight, and I do not have the means to satisfy him." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion evident in his face, the desperation he had clearly tried and failed to fully conceal. "Henry mentioned you had sent word. I only just returned last evening." "I know. I should have waited for a proper meeting, arranged through the usual channels, but I found myself unable to simply wait 3 more days, not knowing whether the estate, and everyone who depends on it, might collapse in the meantime." He paused, something shifting in his expression, a vulnerability she had never before witnessed from him. "I have come to ask for your help, Miss Hartley. Not as a client requesting a service he has already paid for, but as a man who has run out of every other option, standing at your door because I no longer have any pride left to protect me from admitting it." Eleanor felt something complicated stir in her chest, the memory of the ballroom rising unbidden, his voice declaring her unworthy of defense, set now against the raw, unguarded man standing before her at dawn, stripped of every certainty that had once defined him. "Come inside," she said finally, stepping back from the doorway. "It is too cold to discuss this properly on the front step." He followed her into the small study, where the household ledgers still sat from the evening before, and sank into the chair across from her desk, with visible relief, as though the simple act of being allowed inside had lifted some portion of the weight from his shoulders. "Tell me everything," Eleanor said, taking her own seat and drawing a fresh sheet of paper toward herself. "Every detail of what Cross has demanded, and why the terms changed so suddenly." Alistair explained as clearly as his exhausted mind allowed, and Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful and focused, already turning the problem over in her mind, searching for angles and leverage points the way she had done for dozens of clients before him. "There may be a solution," she said finally, once he had finished. "Cross's own creditors are pressing him, which means he needs liquid funds quickly, more than he needs the specific satisfaction of collecting your full debt at once. If we offer him a partial payment now, drawn from the sale of the remaining land parcels we discussed weeks ago, alongside a revised schedule for the remainder at a slightly higher interest rate, it may satisfy his immediate need without requiring the impossible sum he is currently demanding." Alistair stared at her, something like disbelief and profound gratitude mixing openly across his face. "You would still help me, after everything?" Eleanor set down her pen and met his eyes directly, her expression steady and unflinching. "I did not build my reputation by allowing personal feelings to determine who deserves competent work and who does not, Your Grace. Whatever passed between us, your tenants, your staff, and the people who depend on your estate's survival, deserve better than watching it collapse, because I chose to hold a grudge." "That is not the only reason I came here," Alistair said quietly, "though I understand, if it is the only reason you are willing to help. I came because I trust your judgment more than any other person's in this city, and because somewhere over these past months, I stopped seeing you as someone I once wronged, and started seeing you as someone whose good opinion I genuinely wished to earn back." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying the man before her, searching for any trace of the arrogance that had once defined him, finding instead only a tired, sincere honesty that she had not expected and was not entirely certain how to answer. "We will discuss the matter of earning back opinions another time, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice softer than before, though still carefully composed. "For now, let us focus on saving your estate. The rest can wait until there is no longer a crisis standing between us." Alistair nodded, something like hope flickering behind his exhausted eyes for the first time in weeks, and together they bent over the papers spread across her desk, working through the first pale light of dawn toward a solution neither of them could have imagined finding together only months before. The plan Eleanor devised that morning worked exactly as she had predicted. Gideon Cross, faced with the choice between an immediate partial payment and the uncertain prospect of a lengthy legal battle for the full amount, accepted the revised terms within days, relieved to secure liquid funds quickly enough to satisfy his own creditors. The remaining land parcels sold at a fair price, and by early spring, the most pressing threat to the Blackwood estate had finally passed, leaving behind a manageable path toward full recovery that Alistair, true to the discipline he had built over the previous months, continued to follow without complaint or shortcut. News of the estate's survival spread quickly through the same social circles that had so recently abandoned the Duke to his troubles, and Eleanor watched with quiet amusement as several of his former associates, including Beatrice Langford herself, began cautiously reaching out to re-establish connections they had so casually severed only months before. Alistair, to his credit, received these overtures with polite but unmistakable distance, no longer interested in relationships built on nothing more substantial than shared wealth and convenient timing. Eleanor's own reputation, meanwhile, had grown to the point where concealment no longer served any real purpose. With Henry's encouragement, and with her family's finances now fully stabilized through her own careful management, she made the decision to step forward publicly as the consultant behind the name E. Hartley, a choice that caused precisely the kind of stir she had always known it would, among the more traditional members of society, but one that mattered increasingly less to her with each passing week. Merchants who had trusted her work for months continued to do so without hesitation, and several new clients, intrigued rather than deterred by the novelty of her position, sought out her services specifically because of it. Alistair remained one of her clients throughout this transition, their professional relationship settling into something steady and mutually respectful, built on the foundation of everything he had worked to prove over the difficult months since his father's death. But something else had grown quietly alongside the professional arrangement, something neither of them had fully acknowledged until a warm afternoon in late spring, when Alistair arrived at her family's estate, not for a scheduled financial review, but simply to see her. He found her in the garden, sleeves rolled up, helping Charlotte tie back the early roses that had begun climbing along the eastern wall, and he stood for a moment at the edge of the path, watching her laugh at something her sister had said, before she noticed him standing there. "Your Grace," she said, straightening and brushing dirt from her hands, "we have no meeting scheduled today, if I recall correctly." "We do not," Alistair admitted. "I came for a different reason entirely." Charlotte, sensing the moment required privacy, excused herself with a knowing smile, leaving the two of them alone among the rose bushes. "I have spent the past several months trying to become a different man than the one who spoke so carelessly about you at that ball," Alistair said, his voice steady despite the visible nervousness in his posture. "I do not know if I have entirely succeeded, but I know that every improvement I have made, in my finances, in my character, in the way I treat the people around me, has been shaped by watching you prove, again and again, exactly how wrong I once was about your worth." Eleanor said nothing at first, letting the words settle between them, remembering the cold ballroom, the terrace where she had steadied her breathing alone in the dark, the long months of quiet, determined work that had brought her to this exact moment. "I do not require your admiration to know my own worth, Your Grace," she said finally, though there was no coldness in it, only quiet honesty. "I learned that lesson the night you tried to take it from me, and I have carried it with me every day since." "I know," Alistair said. "I am not asking you to need my admiration. I am simply telling you that you have it, freely and completely, whether it changes anything between us or not." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing everything she had witnessed over the past months, the genuine sacrifice, the willingness to defend others the way no one had defended her, the humility that had replaced his old, careless pride. She thought of her father, who had always believed sharp minds and good character mattered more than titles or fortune, and she thought of how far she had traveled since the night a duke declared her unworthy of defense in front of a room full of people eager to agree with him. "I appreciate your honesty, Alistair," she said, using his given name for the first time since they had met, the words settling comfortably between them in a way that surprised them both. "I cannot promise you what comes next between us, only that I no longer see any reason to hold the past against the man standing in front of me now." A slow, genuine smile broke across his face, the first she had seen from him that carried no trace of arrogance or pretense, only simple, honest relief. "That is more than I hoped for, and considerably more than I once deserved." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, allowing herself a small smile of her own, "though I have found that people rarely remain exactly what they once deserved to be, if they are willing to do the work of becoming something better." They stood together in the quiet garden, the late spring sun warm overhead, the roses just beginning to bloom along the wall behind them, and for the first time since that cold night in the ballroom, Eleanor felt no weight at all attached to the memory of his old cruelty, only a quiet, settled sense of her own strength, built entirely by her own hands, standing firmly in the life she had chosen for herself. She did not need him. She had proven that thoroughly, month after month, through work no one had believed her capable of, through a reputation built entirely on her own merit. But standing there in the garden, watching the man who had once dismissed her so easily, now looking at her with genuine, earned respect, she found she was glad, all the same, that he had finally learned to see her clearly. Whatever came next, she intended to meet it the same way she had met everything since that night at the ball, on her own terms, with her own strength, answering to no one's judgment but her own.